Deep beneath the frost-hardened earth, shielded by meters of reinforced concrete and blast-proof steel doors, originally poured during the height of the Cold War, the subterranean command center hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to seep directly into the bones of the men and women stationed there, while the ambient air was intentionally chilled to near freezing to keep the aging, heavily overtaxed server racks from melting down under the strain of processing millions of data points per second. The overnight shifts in this bunker had long ago devolved into a grueling psychological endurance test, an agonizing routine where sleep-deprived operators stared at sweeping green lines until the glowing phosphors burned permanent afterimages into their retinas. Yet tonight, an anomaly was unfolding across the digital map that caused a sudden, suffocating silence to fall over the room, defying the most fundamental, universally accepted laws of aerospace physics. Faint, ghost-like blurs began materializing on the extreme outer edge of the scanning threshold, crawling across the screen with a sluggish, methodical purpose that immediately set off warning bells in the minds of the veteran crew, primarily because these signatures should not have existed in this specific sector at all. They were entirely absent from the anticipated eastern approach vectors, where heavily fortified, multi-layered early warning systems and staggeringly expensive interceptor batteries sat idling in the freezing mud, their crews gripping launch toggles, waiting for an assault that stubbornly refused to arrive. Instead, these strange, flickering contacts were ghosting along a heavily forested, swampy northern perimeter, hugging a jagged geographical line that officially belonged to a sovereign state claiming total neutrality in the ongoing regional conflict, a political boundary that was supposed to act as an impenetrable diplomatic shield. The operators traded nervous, exhausted glances, the smell of stale coffee, ozone, and cold sweat hanging heavy in the confined space, because whatever was creeping along that border was executing synchronized, mathematically flawless left-hand turns, dropping into the defending military's blind spots with a synchronized grace that felt disturbingly unnatural and deeply sinister. But what exactly were they tracking, and why did the mere sight of these slow-moving blips cause seasoned tacticians, men who had survived months of relentless bombardment, to fall into a heavy, panicked silence? The creeping anomalies registering on the scopes were not hypersonic cruise missiles, nor were they multi-million-dollar stealth fighters utilizing radar-absorbent metamaterials. Rather, intelligence assessments indicated they were swarms of cheap, slow-moving, explosive-laden unmanned aerial vehicles, essentially rudimentary flying engines constructed from commercial-grade fiberglass and engineered with a singular, brutal philosophy: to overwhelm sophisticated air defenses through sheer, unmanageable numerical volume. Basic aerodynamic logic dictated that these primitive machines, completely lacking the high-end internal computing architecture required for autonomous, dynamic navigation in contested airspace, should have been dropping blindly from the sky miles before reaching their intended targets. The defending forces had not simply left their skies open, they had already erected a colossal, invisible barrier of localized electromagnetic static across the front lines to prevent this exact scenario, deploying specialized electronic warfare battalions to saturate the airspace with crippling interference. You can understand this countermeasure, a highly effective and invisible form of digital combat, by imagining the sky as a pitch-black room where the drones are trying to listen to a faint, distant whisper representing the signals from navigation satellites in orbit, while the defenders are standing right next to them, blowing a stadium air horn directly into their ears. When the incoming drones hit this localized wall of deafening digital noise, their vital connections to orbital constellations sever instantly, effectively blinding and deafening the machines, stripping them of any external spatial awareness. Stripped of this guidance, standard military doctrine states that these stripped-down munitions must fall back on internal gyroscopes to guess their trajectory, a crude, error-prone method known as inertial navigation, which relies on measuring the aircraft's acceleration and time of flight to estimate its current position relative to its launch point. You can conceptualize this desperate fallback mechanism as closing your eyes while driving down a winding, unfamiliar highway and trying to count the seconds out loud to know exactly when to jerk the steering wheel. An experienced driver might survive for a few terrifying moments, but the longer your eyes remain closed, the further off course you will inevitably drift, compounding tiny errors until disaster strikes. Yet, against every known variable of modern warfare and every mathematical probability calculated by the defense grid's supercomputers, the blips on the bunker's screens were not drifting at all, maintaining tight formations and navigating the chaotic, treacherous topography of the northern frontier with lethal, impossible perfection. They were deliberately threading the needle through some of the most difficult, cluttered airspace on the continent, exploiting an aerospace phenomenon known as ground clutter, where the emitted radar beams reflect off rolling hills, dense, rain-soaked tree canopies, and scattered civilian infrastructure, bouncing back to the receiver as a chaotic mess of digital garbage. Spotting a low-flying, composite material drone within this storm of false returns is computationally as difficult as trying to spot a single, specific gray bird flying perfectly parallel to a gray asphalt highway at dusk while traveling at highway speeds. Someone or something was gently whispering. Course corrections to the crippled machines through the dark, successfully guiding them through the electronic storm. But the true nature of that hidden lifeline remained an absolute mystery, leaving the defending forces bleeding precious, irreplaceable interceptor missiles to counter a threat that technically should have been completely blind. How was a technologically inferior adversary bypassing one of the most sophisticated electronic defense nets ever constructed? And why did the trajectory of these ghost contacts always trace the very edge of a political boundary they were forbidden to cross? Desperate to uncover the source of this impossible navigation before the capital's defense grid collapsed entirely under the strain of exhaustion and depleted ammunition, High Command authorized an aggressive, deeply clandestine intelligence sweep of the northern border, utilizing a complex web of low Earth orbital surveillance, highly compartmentalized human intelligence assets on the ground, and specialized aircraft designed for localized radio frequency interception. If you find this level of granular, tactical deconstruction compelling, and appreciate the days of exhaustive research required to parse through commercial satellite imagery, declassified military doctrine, and raw signals intelligence reports to piece these shadow operations together, consider subscribing, as your direct support is what allows this intensive investigative work to continue uncompromised. The intelligence sweep, conducted over several tense, sleepless nights, yielded a discovery that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Defense Ministry, because the tactical advantage allowing the swarms to bypass the jamming was not coming from a newly developed, highly classified weapon system, but rather from the corruption of the most mundane, everyday civilian infrastructure imaginable. Hidden entirely under the cover of the moonless night, shadowy specialized engineering teams had quietly slipped across the porous border into the neighboring, supposedly non-combatant state, scaling standard commercial cell phone masts that towered over sleepy, unsuspecting border towns and agricultural fields. High above the oblivious civilian residents sleeping below, these insertion teams bolted heavily encrypted, localized military communication repeaters to the commercial steel frames, splicing into local power grids and effectively creating a sprawling, invisible breadcrumb trail of electronic beacons radiating a highly specific frequency. As the deafened, satellite-blinded drone swarms crossed into this compromised corridor, their onboard flight computers simply ignored the unreachable satellites in the exosphere and listened instead to the soft, rhythmic pings radiating from the hijacked civilian infrastructure just across the border, allowing the attackers to establish a secure, unjammable local network that completely bypassed the entire eastern defense grid. This terrifying revelation meant that the attacking force was shamelessly utilizing the sovereign airspace of a nation by stations that publicly swore before the international community it had absolutely zero involvement in the bloodshed, actively hosting the critical architecture of mass destruction while cowardly hiding behind the fragile, legalistic shield of international neutrality. The discovery placed the besieged leadership in a nearly impossible strategic dilemma that carried the weight of millions of lives, as their intelligence services had now definitively proven that Russian forces were actively utilizing Belarusian cell towers to guide their devastating, low-cost, transforming ordinary civilian telecommunications equipment into highly active, entirely legitimate military targets. President Volodymyr Zelensky and his inner circle of military advisors, operating out of their own deeply fortified, sandbagged bunker in the heart of Kiev, realized with sinking dread that standard, politely worded diplomatic protests delivered through the United Nations would fall on completely deaf ears, as Alexander Lukashenko's autocratic regime in Minsk had already demonstrated a deep, historical willingness to appease Moscow's strategic demands in exchange for political survival. The massed aerial assaults funneling freely through this illegally facilitated northern corridor were bleeding Ukraine dry at an unsustainable rate, forcing air defense commanders into the agonizing position of stripping critical, highly advanced Patriot and Iris-T missile batteries away from the grinding, blood-soaked eastern front lines, leaving those troops vulnerable, just to protect the civilians huddled in the darkened, freezing subway stations of the capital. Transporting these massive air defense systems is not as simple as driving a truck. It requires immense logistical convoys, heavy transport vehicles, specialized radar cooling units, and dozens of highly trained personnel, making the batteries incredibly vulnerable to satellite tracking and ambush during the slow, muddy transit. Furthermore, the financial asymmetry of the conflict was reaching a breaking point, as defending commanders were forced to launch interceptor missiles costing upwards of $3 million apiece to destroy fiberglass drones that cost roughly $50,000 to manufacture, a mathematical equation that heavily favored the attackers in a prolonged war of industrial attrition. If you were sitting at the head of that strategy table, staring at a map covered in hostile red tracks, holding the fate of a besieged nation in your hands, would you prioritize the immediate preservation of your airspace by authorizing a preemptive cross-border strike to vaporize those hijacked towers, knowing full well it might provide a neighboring dictator with the perfect, globally televised justification to mobilize his untouched army and open a catastrophic new front? Or would you absorb the financial and human bleeding to contain the political fallout? I'm deeply curious to hear your strategic rationale in the comments, as the complex debates generated there often mirror the exact, unresolvable, agonizing dilemmas faced by the generals standing in those war rooms. Ultimately, after agonizing deliberation and analyzing every conceivable intelligence projection regarding Minsk's threshold for direct conflict, the leadership in Kiev chose a path of immense, terrifying brinkmanship, stepping up to the geopolitical poker table and issuing a quiet but unmistakably lethal ultimatum directly to the Belarusian leadership. This back-channel communication offered a rapidly closing window of just 7 days to completely dismantle the rogue communication network, carrying the unspoken, heavily implied promise that failure to comply would result in the Ukrainian military, already hardened by years of total war, physically crossing the border with long-range strike drones to violently solve the problem themselves, regardless of the diplomatic fallout. The psychological weight bearing down on the Belarusian autocrat during those ensuing hours must have been suffocating, as his own intelligence directors and generals were undoubtedly acutely aware that their aging, heavily scripted armed forces were entirely unprepared to absorb a high-tech, punitive, decentralized drone assault from a battle-tested neighbor that had recently proven its willingness to launch audacious incursions into hostile territory. Lukashenko found himself trapped in a geopolitical vice, forced to weigh the wrath of his primary political patron in Moscow against the immediate, explosive reality of Ukrainian munitions detonating against infrastructure deeply embedded within his own civilian population centers, a scenario that could rapidly destabilize his grip on domestic power. The global intelligence community, monitoring the spike in encrypted communications between the capitals, braced for a defiant refusal, operating under the assumption that the Kremlin would exert overwhelming, coercive pressure on its smaller ally to maintain the tactical advantage and call Kiev's bluff. Yet, the expected escalation, the spark that many feared would ignite a regional conflagration, never materialized, and the standoff resolved itself in a manner that deeply shocked everyone watching the crisis unfold from the safety of their distant observation posts. Just 3 days after the ultimatum was delivered, less than half the time allotted by the Ukrainian president, the northern radar scopes inside the subterranean command centers suddenly, inexplicably, went completely dark, devoid of the creeping hostile tracks that had haunted the operators for weeks. The rogue signal repeaters bolted to the commercial towers abruptly stopped broadcasting their guidance frequencies, the invisible electronic breadcrumb trail evaporated into the ether, and the synchronized, devastating Shahed swarms funneling through the northern corridor ceased their incursions entirely, granting the exhausted, terrorized citizens of Kyiv their first real moments of quiet, uninterrupted sleep in months. On the surface, the sudden, sweeping silence felt like a miraculous, bloodless triumph of statecraft and coercion, a rare moment in modern history where diplomacy backed by the highly credible threat of extreme, targeted violence actually achieved its precise operational goal without a single shot being fired. However, seasoned military planners, the men who study the grim mathematics of logistics rather than the optics of political victories, completely missed one critical, underlying detail about how mechanized attrition warfare functions on a macro scale. A realization that quickly turned this apparent strategic triumph into a sprawling logistical nightmare. The attackers, operating from deep within the safety of the Russian interior, had not lost a single drone, launch crew, or factory in this tense diplomatic exchange. They had simply lost the convenience of a specific geographical routing option. Consequently, the exact same volume of explosive munitions rolling off the assembly lines would now simply be aggressively rerouted toward the eastern and southern flanks, vectors that were already buckled under the strain of continuous combat, rendering the localized relief felt in the capital entirely illusory. Ukrainian commanders were now trapped in a vicious, reactive logistical cycle, forced to once again uproot their heavy, delicate radar arrays and mobile missile launchers, dragging the multi-ton equipment through the muddy, freezing terrain of the changing seasons to plug the newly reinforced enemy attack vectors along the eastern steppes. The agonizing reality setting in among the Defense Ministry was that the nation's air defense grid was just as strained as before the ultimatum, merely stretched across different coordinates, perfectly demonstrating the brutal balloon effect of modern combat, where successfully crushing a localized threat in one zone practically guarantees a violent, concentrated expansion of violence in another. But a far more terrifying surprise was still waiting in the freezing shadows of the silent border, a lingering variable because the true nature of Belarus's sudden compliance remained disturbingly ambiguous to the intelligence analysts tasked with verifying the shutdown. Did the authorities in Minsk actually dispatch specialized engineering crews with climbing gear to physically scale the freezing steel masts, sever the heavy power cables, and physically smash the Russian-installed hardware with heavy tools, permanently destroying the network? Or did a nervous, sweating technician simply access a remote command terminal in a distant server room and flip a digital switch to temporarily pause the transmissions? This technical distinction changes the entire strategic calculus of the war, because if the physical hardware remains intact on those towers, merely sleeping instead of destroyed, the attacking force retains the horrifying ability to reactivate the entire guidance network with a single keystroke, a looming, invisible threat that completely paralyzes defending commanders. The military leadership in Kiev cannot fully abandon the northern corridor, forced by the sheer uncertainty of the situation to keep precious, highly capable interceptor missiles and their exhausted crews idling in the dark, guarding against a phantom threat that could resurrect itself without a moment's warning, tying up resources that are desperately needed to stop the bleeding in the east. The sheer, grinding psychological exhaustion of this uncertainty breeds a dangerous, volatile temptation inside the subterranean command bunkers, a growing, whispered consensus among the frustrated officer corps that mere electronic silence is no longer an acceptable guarantee of national security, and that the only true, lasting safety lies in sending a wave of low-flying, explosive FPV drones across the border to ensure those civilian towers never broadcast a military signal again.